In the winter of the year 40, Rome did not feel like Rome. The fire still burned in the hearths, the streets still echoed with the clatter of sandals, and the markets still overflowed with grain from Egypt. Yet a strange and unnatural cold had settled upon the city. This was not the chill of the season. It was not a matter of temperature or climate. It was something far deeper, something that crept into the very marrow of the Roman soul. It came not from the Tiber's icy mists, nor from the winds that howled across the hills. It came from the marble heart of power itself, the Palatine Hill, where the emperor resided. The people whispered his name as though it were a curse, yet none dared to speak it too loudly. Officially, he was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. To the soldiers who once adored him, he had been Caligula, Little Boot, the beloved boy who had grown up in their camps. But by the year 40, that affectionate nickname had curdled into something grotesque. The same legions who had once carried him on their shoulders now muttered the word as if it belonged to a demon. The cold of this winter was not measured in degrees, but in humiliations. It was not the frost of nature, but the frost of power. Power that no longer relied on executions or prescriptions, but on a new kind of cruelty. Caligula had learned that fear could make men obey, but shame could make them collapse from within. And so he designed not a reign of terror in the crude sense, but a reign of degradation, an architecture of humiliation. He hollowed out Rome's nobility not by killing their bodies, but by murdering their dignity. Consider the case of Marcus Claudius, a senator of unimpeachable ancestry, a man whose forefathers had bled for the Republic and guided its destiny for centuries. Tradition should have protected him. Status should have shielded him. But in Caligula's Rome, no lineage was sacred, no history untouchable. Summoned to the imperial palace, Marcus expected perhaps a rebuke, perhaps a lecture. Instead, he was handed a torch. He was commanded to hold it aloft, to stand in silence as his descendants, his own bloodline, were subjected to calculated violation before his eyes. His role was not to speak, not to intervene, not to resist. His role was illumination. He became the light by which the destruction of his family was made visible. This was no isolated cruelty. It was a template, an orchestrated performance designed to make every senator, every nobleman, a participant in his own undoing. Fathers watched daughters, brothers heard sisters, husbands listened to wives, all silenced by the knowledge that intervention would mean annihilation for their entire household. Survival required complicity, and complicity meant permanent dishonor. The records of these acts survive not in poetry or rumor alone, but in the chilling banality of administration. Imperial clerks kept ledgers as though they were recording grain rations or military supplies. Names, numbers, durations, outcomes, each suffering reduced to a line item, each ordeal transformed into bureaucratic paperwork. Violence had become systematized. Cruelty had become a department of state. Rome was watching the birth of something monstrous, a tyranny not of swords, but of forms, seals, and signatures. Caligula's genius, if one dares to call it that, was not in brutality itself. Any thug could terrorize with a blade. His innovation was the demand for involuntary complicity. He forced his victims not only to endure, but to participate, to carry the guilt of their own degradation. By compelling fathers to serve as witnesses, by coercing senators into signing legal documents that ratified their wives' and daughters' service to the emperor, he ensured that no man could later claim innocence. To resist was to perish. To comply was to live, but at the price of permanent corruption, fear could be overcome with courage. Shame, however, was eternal. Fear might be forgotten with time. Shame etched itself into memory, into family honor, into the bloodlines of Rome. Caligula understood this truth. He was not merely punishing individuals, he was poisoning dynasties. His aim was not the temporary subjugation of the Senate. His aim was to salt the soil from which the Senate grew, ensuring that no future generation could stand proudly upon the legacy of its ancestors. Ancient historians, usually so fond of detached language and matter-of-fact narration, speak of this period in hushed tones. Suetonius hints, Tacitus alludes, Dio whispers. Even centuries later, when memory should have dulled and scandal should have become myth, the chroniclers struggled to put into words what Rome had endured. They do not write like impartial observers. They write like survivors who cannot cleanse themselves of what they have seen, and what they saw was not simply cruelty, it was not merely excess. It was an emperor turning shame into a political instrument, weaponizing intimacy, forcing Rome's proudest men and women into a theater of dishonor where they themselves were actors. Every senator who passed through the great bronze doors of the Palatine Palace knew that he would not emerge merely as a victim, but as a collaborator in his own disgrace. This was the climate of Rome in the winter of 40. Not frost, not snow, but a suffocating cold that froze the spirit, that made men avoid one another's eyes in the Senate, that silenced conversations in the forums. For what could one say when one's neighbor had seen, or worse, participated in, the unthinkable? What words could be spoken in a city where silence had become the only guarantee of survival? Caligula had crafted a Rome where every man was guilty, where every woman carried scars both visible and invisible, and where every family bore secrets too poisonous to ever be spoken aloud. The city itself became complicit, the marble and stone of its monuments resonating with silence, the silence of a people who had been taught that to speak was to perish, and to remember was to suffer. This was the Rome of Caligula in the year 40, a city where shame was law, humiliation was ritual, and power was measured not in the blood spilled on the streets, but in the broken dignity of its noblest families. It was not the Rome of Caesar nor of Augustus. It was something new, something darker, something colder, and to understand how the heart of the civilized world descended into this abyss, we must turn back the clock, back to a morning in the year 37, when the same man who now ruled by humiliation had once been hailed as the very hope of Rome. In the spring of the year 37, Rome awoke to a dawn it had not known for decades. The empire's throne, long poisoned by suspicion and tyranny under Tiberius, now passed to a young man of only 25 years. His name, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But the people did not call him Gaius, they called him Caligula, Little Boot. It was a name born of affection, a name whispered in soldiers' camps when he was a child running between the tents of his father's legions. It was the name of hope, for Caligula was no ordinary heir. He was the son of Germanicus, Rome's golden general, the man who had carried the eagle standards across the Rhine, who had embodied Roman virtue in its purest form. Germanicus was not just a commander. He was a symbol. To his troops, he had been more than a man. He was Rome itself. His sudden death, almost certainly by poison, had left the empire in mourning, a wound that had never healed. To see his son ascend was to see Germanicus reborn. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Rome did not merely welcome its new emperor, it erupted into euphoria. The transition of power, so often stained with blood, was greeted instead with celebration. The Senate, long cowed under the paranoia of Tiberius, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Here was a young man, cultured, educated, charismatic, who smiled instead of glared, who embraced instead of scowled. For the first time in a generation, senators dared to hope that they could advise, not just obey. The people filled the streets. They sang songs about their new ruler. Women scattered flowers in the path of his litter. Children followed him through the forum, chanting his name. To them, he was not a distant monarch. He was a presence. He dined openly with nobles, attended games at the Circus Maximus, walked the streets without bodyguards. Where Tiberius had hidden himself away in the fortress palaces of Capri, Caligula stepped into the light of the people. Rome, weary of shadows, rejoiced in this sudden sun. The young emperor seemed to justify every hope placed upon him. He slashed unjust taxes that had burdened the provinces. He ordered the release of political prisoners who had languished in cells for years under his predecessor's suspicion. He commissioned grand spectacles, games that rivaled the greatest festivals in memory, and he personally attended them, sitting among the people, laughing, applauding, living as though he were one of them. The contrast could not have been more absolute. Where Tiberius had ruled with silence and fear, Caligula ruled with generosity and joy. His reforms extended beyond gestures. He invested in Rome's infrastructure, commissioning aqueducts to bring fresh water, repairing roads neglected by years of paranoia, distributing long-overdue bonuses to the legions. The soldiers who had once adored his father now adored him, not merely because of blood, but because he rewarded their loyalty with tangible gratitude. Rome's military heart was secured not by fear but by love. For 100 days, the city indulged in uninterrupted celebration. Historians record feasts that spilled into every street, games that lasted from sunrise to sunset, songs sung in every tavern, After the stifling rule of Tiberius, this was nothing less than a golden dawn. Citizens spoke of Caligula as though he were a divine gift, an answer to prayer. Senators, desperate to align themselves with his favor, showered him with honors, competing to outdo one another in praise. Statues were raised, coins minted, decrees passed, all proclaiming the arrival of a new age, and at the center of this storm of joy was Caligula himself. Charismatic, eloquent, well-versed in the arts and literature of Greece, trained in the oratory of Rome, he dazzled every audience. He was no recluse, no shadow of a man. He was vivid, alive, magnetic. To women, he was the embodiment of youth and virility. To men, he was the promise of strength and stability. To the legions, he was the son of Germanicus. To the Senate, he was a partner, not a tyrant. To the people, he was the salvation they had longed for. It seemed impossible in those first months to imagine the darkness to come. How could such a figure, born of noble blood, raised among legions, adored by the people, fall so far? How could the city that once chanted his name in the streets one day whisper it in fear? But already, beneath the glitter of festivals and the laughter of feasts, faint cracks began to show, almost invisible, but there. They were not the rages of a tyrant, not yet. They were glimpses, brief and unsettling, of something beneath the mask, a look too cold, a silence too long, an eccentricity too arrogant to be dismissed. Few noticed. Fewer still dared to question. The empire, drunk on joy, ignored the warning signs. They told themselves that every odd decree was youthful enthusiasm, every outburst the impatience of a new ruler. After all, had he not given them freedom after years of suspicion? Had he not restored honor after years of fear? Had he not given Rome reason to laugh again? The people forgave him everything because they believed they owed him everything. The Senate, eager to preserve their fragile relief, looked the other way. When Caligula hinted at divine status, they told themselves it was theatricality. When he indulged in extravagance, they called it generosity. No one wanted to believe that beneath the charm and the charisma lay something else, something darker, something waiting. For in those days, Rome did not see the monster that history would record. It saw only a young man stepping into destiny, a beacon of hope after years of darkness. He was the dream of Germanicus reborn, the child of the legions, the sun after a long night. But dreams are fragile, and in the autumn of that same year, when sickness struck him down and brought him to the brink of death, the dream would shatter. The man who rose from that bed would not be the same man who had ascended the throne. Rome had prayed for his survival, but it would come to regret the answer. The autumn of 37 began like any other season in Rome. Festivals to honor the gods, trade bustling through the ports of Ostia, the legions drilling along the distant frontiers. The city still hummed with the energy of its young emperor's reforms, still bathed in the afterglow of the 100 days of celebration that had greeted his rise. But then, without warning, the golden dawn darkened. Caligula fell ill. At first, it was whispered as nothing more than fatigue, a young ruler overwhelmed by the demands of empire. But within days, the whispers turned to cries of panic. The emperor was bedridden, his body convulsing, his skin burning with fever so fierce that the palace physicians feared his flesh would blister. He raved in delirium, speaking not to mortals but to gods. Servants claimed to hear him shouting in the night, holding arguments with Jupiter himself, demanding equality with the King of Heaven. Rome froze. For weeks, the empire teetered in suspense. Priests sacrificed at every temple, from the mighty Capitolium to the smallest shrines on back streets, begging the gods to spare their emperor. Families made vows in the Forum, promising to give their own lives in exchange for Caligula's recovery. Mothers tore at their hair. Fathers wept in public. The city that had just begun to breathe freely after years of Tiberius's suffocating rule now held its breath again, terrified of losing the man who had given it joy. The physicians' journals describe scenes that border on the impossible, temperatures soaring beyond endurance, seizures so violent that 6 men struggled to restrain him, visions that seemed to drag him into another world. For days his life hung in the balance. Senators prepared for the worst. Rumors spread that the Julio-Claudian line itself might collapse into chaos, and then, suddenly, miraculously, he awoke. The fever broke. His breathing steadied. His strength began to return. Rome erupted in jubilation. The gods, it seemed, had answered. Citizens flooded the temples again, this time with thanksgiving. Sacrifices were doubled, hymns resounded, wine flowed freely. The young emperor had stared into the abyss and returned. Surely this was a sign of divine favor. Surely this was proof that the gods had chosen him for greatness, but those closest to him whispered a different truth. The man who opened his eyes that morning was not the same man who had collapsed weeks before. Something had shifted, something profound, something irreversible. The first signs were subtle, almost dismissible as eccentricities. His eyes, once warm and expressive, seemed colder, more calculating. Poets who had praised their brightness now described them as voids, black pools that reflected no light. His nights were restless, his insomnia relentless. Servants found him wandering the silent corridors of the palace long after midnight, speaking animatedly to the statues that lined its halls. But these were no longer the statues of gods. His first decree after recovery was chilling in its arrogance. The most revered images of Rome's pantheon, Jupiter, Apollo, Mars, were to have their heads removed. In their place would be marble likenesses of himself. The gods of Rome were not to be honored as protectors. They were to be replaced. Rome, stunned but still basking in gratitude for his survival, approved the measure. Senators dismissed it as youthful flamboyance, the indulgence of a man intoxicated by divine favor. But it was no mere gesture. It was a declaration of war on heaven. At night, he stood on the palace balconies, gazing at the moon. Sometimes he pleaded with it, beckoning it down to share his bed. Other times he threatened it, shouting obscenities into the sky, furious that it defied his summons. He was found at dawn in the imperial gardens, naked and covered in soil, his hands raw from digging. When questioned, he smiled serenely and said he was planting the future of Rome. But no seeds lay in the earth, only the roots of madness, pushing deeper each day. The illness had not merely shaken his body, it had fractured something in his mind. The charming youth who had once laughed with the people was dissolving. In his place emerged a figure darker, stranger, consumed by visions of divinity and supremacy. He no longer spoke as though he ruled by the gods' favor. He spoke as though he was a god, as though Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo were his equals, or his rivals. The Senate still clung to their illusions. They told themselves that eccentricity was harmless. They told themselves that a man who had suffered so close a brush with death was entitled to strange behaviors. They told themselves what they had to in order to sleep at night. But Rome was no longer ruled by the same man it had adored in spring, and in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, the first tremors of dread began to stir. Servants whispered of his sleepless rants. Guards exchanged uneasy glances at his erratic commands. The sisters of Caligula, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, Agrippina, saw it most clearly. They were no longer family. They were becoming subjects in an experiment, test cases for a man who believed he had transcended the boundaries of mortal law. The illness had left scars, but not on his skin. The scars lay in his mind, in his soul, in the way he looked at the world. To Rome, his recovery was a miracle. To Caligula, it was a rebirth. He had faced death and returned, not as the same man, but as something greater, something untouchable, something divine. The fever had not spared him. It had broken him. And in that breaking, it had remade him into the architect of a tyranny that would not simply terrify Rome, but humiliate it, degrade it, and hollow it out from within. The empire had prayed for his survival. The empire had begged the gods to spare him. The empire had been answered. And in that answer lay its ruin. Power, when it turns inward, first consumes the bonds closest to it. After his illness, Caligula did not immediately unleash his cruelty on the Senate or the people of Rome. He began at home. He began with his sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, Agrippina the Younger, daughters of Germanicus, granddaughters of Agrippina the Elder, nieces of Tiberius, scions of Rome's most illustrious bloodline. To the world, they were noble women. To Caligula, they became subjects in a new experiment, test cases for his evolving vision of absolute rule. Of the three, it was Drusilla who occupied the central place in his obsession. She was not merely his sibling, she was his chosen consort. He paraded her through the streets and forums not as a sister, but as an empress. At banquets, she occupied the place reserved for the emperor's wife, seated at his side in a spectacle that violated every Roman custom. In public, he called her not sister, but Diana, his goddess of the hunt. Senators, accustomed to tolerating eccentricities, now sat in silence as the emperor elevated incest into a political theater, daring anyone to object. None did. It was not love in the Roman sense, not pietas, not family devotion. It was possession. Drusilla was transformed into a symbol, proof that even the most sacred boundary, that between brother and sister, was irrelevant in Caligula's Rome. By flaunting this violation openly, he sent a message more powerful than 1,000 executions. No tradition was beyond his reach, no taboo beyond his contempt. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38, perhaps from illness, perhaps from poison, the emperor's reaction revealed the depth of his fixation. His grief was not the mourning of a brother. It was the fury of a god denied his favorite possession. He plunged the empire into forced mourning. An edict forbade laughter, bathing, or dining with family. To smile in those days was treason. To show joy was death. Citizens moved through Rome like shades in the underworld, silent, grim, enslaved to a grief that was not their own. But grief did not temper him. It transformed his obsession. With Drusilla gone, his attention turned with a feverish intensity to his remaining sisters. Julia, Livilla, and Agrippina were drawn into the same orbit, compelled into roles that blurred every line of kinship. The emperor's palace became less a home than a stage, less a family residence than a laboratory of power, where he tested how far he could bend the natural order without breaking it, yet his experiments did not end with blood. Having shattered the sanctity of his own family, he widened the scope. What began in private became public policy. The wives of senators, once untouchable symbols of Rome's honor, were summoned to the palace under the guise of imperial banquets. There they were not guests but captives. Their dignity was stripped away as easily as their garments. What Caligula had done with his sisters, he now did with the nobility's daughters and wives. The emperor's desire was not limited to possession. It was domination disguised as ritual, violation rebranded as honor. He declared that to be chosen for his bed was a privilege, an initiation into divine service. Senators were forced to sign contracts presenting their wives' and daughters' submission as voluntary offerings. Fathers, husbands, and brothers became the scribes of their family's degradation. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated, and public. Caligula wanted not only to satisfy himself but to implicate Rome's elite in their own dishonor. He wanted every senator to leave the palace with the knowledge that his silence had purchased survival at the cost of his family's dignity. The case of Senator Publius Cornelius stands as a grim example. When commanded to deliver his wife Livia to the emperor, he refused. On the Senate floor, in a trembling but courageous voice, he spoke of Roman honor, of tradition, of the sanctity of marriage. His words fell into silence. No one joined him. No one echoed his defiance. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found bleeding on the Senate steps, castrated, a crude warning carved into his chest. Disobedience has generational consequences. That afternoon, a broken Publius Cornelius escorted his wife to the palace gates. Months later, when she was confirmed to be carrying Caligula's child, Cornelius was forced to stand before the Senate and legally acknowledge the bastard as his legitimate heir. With the stroke of a pen, he disinherited his true-born children. Humiliation had become law. This was the lesson of Caligula's family experiment. By first desecrating his own bloodline, he established the precedent. By expanding it to Rome's nobility, he institutionalized it. Fathers became pimps. Wives became captives. Children became sacrifices. The family, the sacred Roman unit of pietas, was turned against itself. It was not chaotic lust. It was strategy. It was a program of annihilation, carried out not with armies but with rituals, not with swords but with signatures. By making Rome's families complicit in their own disgrace, he achieved something no tyrant before him had managed. He turned his victims into collaborators. The senators of Rome had once prided themselves on lineage, on virtue, on the honor of their wives and children. Now those very sources of pride became instruments of shame. No man could claim innocence. Every household carried a secret. Every father bore a silent torch. Thus the Palatine Hill became less a palace than a temple, though its god was no Jupiter, no Mars, no Apollo. Its god was Caligula himself, and its rituals were violations masquerading as worship. His sisters had been the first offerings. The nobility of Rome followed, and the city that had once celebrated his rise now began, slowly and silently, to suffocate under the weight of its shame. The emperor's private desecration of family boundaries was only the beginning. By the year 39, what had begun with his sisters had grown into something larger, something more terrifying. Caligula was no longer content with isolated acts of possession. He sought structure. He sought design. He sought to engineer humiliation as though it were an art form, and the palace itself became the theater. The grand reception halls of the Palatine, once the stage for diplomatic embassies and senatorial debates, were remade into temples of obscenity. Caligula gave them names borrowed from Rome's gods: the Hall of Jupiter, the Chamber of Venus, the Room of Priapus. Each had a function, each a ritual, each a role in his architecture of degradation. The Hall of Jupiter was reserved for ritualized assaults. Here the emperor, sometimes dressed in the guise of the god himself, proclaimed his divine supremacy over the women brought before him. The Chamber of Venus was used for orchestrated orgies, where matrons of Rome, the wives of consuls, the daughters of patricians, were compelled to reenact mythological scenes of abduction and violation. The Room of Priapus was smaller, darker, its walls adorned with grotesque frescoes commissioned by the emperor himself. It was not a place for spectacle but for torture, where screams were muted by marble. Caligula presided over these scenes from a gilded throne, a deliberate echo of Jupiter's seat on Olympus. He did not merely participate. He directed, he observed, he judged. In his hand, a wax tablet on which he took meticulous notes. He recorded who showed enthusiasm, who resisted, who tried to comfort the woman they were paired with. It was a performance review of depravity. The Senate quickly understood the consequences. Enthusiasm brought favor. Hesitation brought ruin. One senator, caught attempting to show mercy to a trembling young woman, saw his son vanish days later, only to be returned maimed and mutilated. Another, who embraced his role with grotesque eagerness, found his political fortunes rising overnight. His proposals in the Senate met with imperial approval. Every act was a transaction. Every violation was currency. The price of survival was complicity. The system was not chaos. It was bureaucracy disguised as ritual. Scribes sat at designated benches, styluses scratching across wax tablets, recording each act in chilling detail: the names, the durations, the participants, the results. These records did not vanish into secrecy. They were preserved in archives used as blackmail, wielded as weapons. No senator could feign ignorance. His silence was inscribed in ink. His guilt was codified in ledgers. This was Caligula's true innovation. Tyrants before him had ruled by fear, but fear was fleeting. He ruled by shame, and shame was permanent. By forcing Rome's nobility to participate in their own debasement, he ensured that none could claim the mantle of virtue. Each senator was both victim and accomplice, both degraded and complicit in degradation. The Senate became less a governing body than a gallery of co-conspirators. The case of Publius Cornelius, the man who had once dared to refuse, now stood as a warning etched into every senator's mind. His son's mutilation, his wife's forced pregnancy, his public acknowledgement of a bastard child, this was not merely punishment. It was a demonstration. Caligula had shown that resistance would not only fail, but would rebound upon the very things a Roman held most sacred: family, honor, lineage. The message was absolute. Survival required collaboration. The rituals themselves were given the trappings of religion. Women forced into these ceremonies were not called victims, but priestesses of the imperial cult. They were dressed in transparent silks imported from Syria, garments so costly that the irony of their purpose was inescapable. They were given schedules, uniforms, and protocols. Fathers signed documents framing their daughters' participation as offerings to the sacred body of the emperor. To the Roman imagination, steeped in myths where gods often took mortal women by force, Caligula's perversions were framed as divine emulation. He was not merely violating customs. He was updating tradition. If Jupiter could disguise himself as a bull or a swan to satisfy his lust, why should Caligula not declare himself Jupiter incarnate, sanctifying his own acts as religious rites? The Senate did not resist. They applauded. They passed decrees. They voted honors. They called his union with women of Rome a sacred privilege, legislating violation into law. One infamous decree, the Lex de Sacro Corpore, formally declared the emperor's body divine, and any union with it, no matter the circumstances, a holy act. With the stroke of a pen, humiliation became worship. The palace was transformed, but so was the Senate. Men who once prided themselves on gravitas and virtus now measured their survival by the enthusiasm with which they participated in their own debasement. Fathers no longer protected their daughters. Husbands no longer guarded their wives. They delivered them, signed them over, escorted them to the palace gates. It was not a Rome of laws and honor. It was a Rome of contracts and shame. And every contract signed, every torch held, every silence kept tightened the chains binding the nobility to the emperor's will. Caligula's orgies were not orgies in the sense of indulgence. They were not hedonistic abandon. They were laboratories of power, meticulously designed to destroy the will of Rome's ruling class. Each scream, each note scratched into a tablet, each broken family bond was a brick in the structure he was building. An empire not of free men but of hollow shells, their dignity stripped away, their complicity ensured. This was not chaos. This was order. This was engineering. Rome's nobility, once the architects of empire, had been reduced to actors in a play written by their emperor. And the curtain rose not in joy but in shame. Power in Rome had always been recorded. Taxes, military rosters, grain supplies, population counts, every corner of the empire was measured, documented, and archived. Caligula, however, introduced a new category to Rome's meticulous records, the ledger of humiliation. Beneath the Palatine Hill, in hidden chambers guarded by the Praetorians, a secret archive was established. It was not a chaotic storehouse of rumors and whispers. It was an office, a machine of clerks, scribes, physicians, and accountants whose sole duty was to preserve the details of degradation. They worked not with poetry, not with moral judgment, but with the cold dispassion of bureaucrats. To them, each victim was not a woman, not a daughter, not a wife. She was an entry. The categories were precise: name, age, social status, family connections, a physical description so exact it could have been used for a military census. Then came the acts performed, their duration, the number of participants, the outcome. Notes on cooperation or resistance. A column for pregnancies confirmed, another for payments received. Nothing was too small to record. The suffering of Rome's nobility was reduced to neat lines of wax and ink, stored in orderly rows of tablets. Physicians played their role with equal detachment. Before women were brought into service, they were examined like livestock, their fertility assessed, their health recorded, their bodies measured for resilience. Afterward, they were inspected again, injuries noted, diseases documented, pregnancies confirmed or denied. Midwives were kept on the payroll, tasked with attending forced births and logging the results. These records were not discarded. They were preserved, cataloged, indexed for reference. The numbers themselves became instruments of control. 16 sestertii for a senator's wife, 2,000 for his virgin daughter, 5,000 for both together. A price list for human dignity entered into the state's official accounts as voluntary donations. The treasury swelled, its ledgers reflecting profit not from trade or conquest, but from systematic violation. Rome's degradation was bankrolling the empire. Every layer of society was implicated. The scribes who wrote the names, the physicians who performed the examinations, the accountants who recorded the payments, the guards who escorted the victims, the senators who signed the contracts all had their part. Each played a role so small it could be excused as duty, yet together they formed a machine of horror. No single person bore the full weight of guilt. It was dispersed, diluted, spread across hundreds. It was easier that way. The machine became faceless, unstoppable, a network of complicity. Caligula understood the psychology of this bureaucracy. To execute a man was to make a martyr. To humiliate him on paper was to erase him as a moral being. Fathers who once stood proudly in the Senate now found their family's shame filed away like grain receipts, their household reduced to data points. Their silence became permanent, their complicity preserved in ink. The bureaucracy did not merely preserve the system, it expanded it. On nights of the full moon, when Caligula staged his most elaborate ceremonies, teams of scribes worked feverishly, recording every detail. In the private amphitheater of the palace, where senators were forced to watch their wives degraded by gladiators and slaves, men with tablets sat in designated sections, noting times, acts, reactions. Every performance was archived. Every humiliation immortalized. The records themselves became weapons. On occasion, the emperor would summon the Senate and have entries read aloud at random. A senator would sit, pale and silent, as the clinical details of his wife's or daughter's ordeal were recited before his peers. Entry 346, Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius Primus, 4 hours. 6 participants. Pregnancy confirmed. It was not the act itself that destroyed him. It was the public reading, the forced acknowledgement, the knowledge that every man in the chamber knew. Rome had always prided itself on its archives, on its ability to preserve memory for generations. Caligula twisted that pride into a curse. The archives of humiliation were designed not to fade, not to be forgotten. He wanted the shame to endure, to outlive the victims, to haunt their descendants. Memory itself became a prison. The city adapted, as cities always do. Merchants began selling ointments and oils to mask the physical scars. Healers brewed dangerous abortifacients in secret. Procurers offered lessons in survival techniques for noble daughters. Even poets played their role, composing odes that cloaked atrocities in mythological language, praising the emperor as a new Jupiter, turning rape into divine ritual. Everyone profited. Everyone participated. The sickness of the palace seeped into the city until Rome itself was complicit. Resistance was rare and always fatal. Women who attempted suicide were revived by imperial physicians only to face double sessions as punishment. Those who scarred themselves to avoid service were forced to participate anyway, their disfigurement declared proof of purity. Families who tried to flee were hunted down, their children executed as warnings. Every avenue of escape was closed, every act of defiance transformed into an example. And all the while, the archives grew. Thousands of entries, each one a monument to degradation, each one a record that no decree of damnatio memoriae could erase. Even when the emperor himself would fall, even when his statues were destroyed and his name chiseled from stone, these records remained hidden in the substructures, a silent testimony to the system he built. For Caligula had discovered something terrible. Power does not need spectacle to endure. It can live in documents, in signatures, in ledgers. Violence is temporary. Bureaucracy is eternal. By turning humiliation into paperwork, he ensured that the shame of Rome would outlast his own life. The empire had created a machine for conquest and governance. He had corrupted it into a machine for degradation. This was the Rome of the year 40. Not merely a city ruled by a tyrant, but a city catalogued by one. A Rome where every family's dishonor was preserved in official form, where every senator's silence was written into history, where every act of survival was also an act of complicity. And the most chilling truth was this: the machine did not depend on Caligula alone. He had built it, but hundreds maintained it. When he was gone, the scars would remain. The ledgers would survive. The memory of humiliation would be embedded in the very institutions of Rome. The empire had long known cruelty. It had long known excess, but never before had it known this: the cold efficiency of a bureaucracy of horror, where the destruction of dignity was organized, recorded, and archived with the same meticulous care as the census of citizens or the tally of legions. Rome was not simply ruled. Rome was administered into shame. Rome had always defined itself through bonds: the bond of father to son, the bond of husband to wife, the bond of mother to child. These were not private matters alone. They were the very foundation of Roman identity. A man's honor was measured in the dignity of his household. A woman's virtue was the cornerstone of her family's standing. The devotion of children to parents, the pietas that tied generations together, was the glue that held the republic and later the empire. Caligula understood this. And so he sought not merely to rule Rome, but to unmake it. He attacked not its armies or its laws, but its most sacred ties. Where others conquered with legions, he conquered with humiliation. The men of Rome were the first to feel this assault in their sons. Caligula summoned the boys of noble families to the palace, stripped them of their togas, and clothed them in saffron-dyed robes, the garb of courtesans. Their faces were painted with white lead and red ochre, cosmetics of prostitutes. Servants trained them to walk with swaying hips, to gesture with affected softness, to speak in tones that mocked the gravity of Roman masculinity. These were the heirs of patrician houses, the future of the Senate, paraded before their fathers in feminized disguise. At imperial banquets, they were displayed as entertainment. Guests laughed, applauded, jeered, even as their own sons stumbled through the grotesque parody. Some boys were auctioned for the night, sold to the highest bidder among Caligula's companions. The emperor himself sometimes joined in, not out of desire, but out of pure assertion of power. Each transaction was a declaration. Rome's most sacred ideal, the virtues of its young men, was nothing more than a costume to be stripped away at will. If sons were degraded, daughters fared no better. From the age of 12, sometimes younger, they were drawn into what Caligula called divine education. It was no education at all, but a gradual initiation into his system of ritualized violation. Their mothers, already broken, watched as their children were introduced into the same machinery that had consumed them. The boundary between generations was shattered. Worst of all was the deliberate destruction of the mother-child bond. In scenes too cruel for the imagination, Caligula would force daughters to witness the violation of their mothers, then force mothers to watch their daughters. He narrated these ordeals aloud, providing commentary as though reciting poetry, praising screams, noting expressions, mocking attempts at comfort. By turning love itself into theater, he struck at the very heart of Roman pietas. The message was clear. Nothing was sacred. Not a father's authority, not a son's masculinity, not a mother's virtue, not a child's innocence. All could be twisted, corrupted, and weaponized. Some tried to resist. Women attempted suicide, drinking poison or cutting their veins before they could be summoned. Caligula's physicians, masters of antidotes, revived them and sent them back. Their punishment doubled. Others scarred themselves with knives or fire, hoping that disfigurement would spare them. Caligula only laughed, declaring ugliness purer for divine service. Even scars became part of the ritual. There was no escape. Fathers who once stood as guardians of their households became something else entirely, reluctant accomplices. They held the torches that lit the halls where their daughters were taken. They signed the contracts that presented their wives' service as voluntary. They voted in the Senate to ratify laws that enshrined the emperor's body as sacred. Each act, each signature, was a betrayal of everything Rome had once considered inviolable. The silent transformation was devastating. Fathers were reduced to pimps. Mothers became accomplices. Children became sacrifices. Families rotted from within, not by external force but by internal complicity. Caligula had perfected the art of making victims into collaborators, ensuring that shame was carried in every Roman household. The story of Valeria, the daughter of a minor senator, captures the horror. After months of systematic abuse, she stopped speaking. Physicians confirmed her vocal cords were uninjured. Her silence was chosen, as if she had decided that no words in any language could capture her reality. In the palace, she became a spectral presence, walking without sound, her vacant stare a mirror in which others saw their own broken future. Servants avoided her eyes, terrified that her silence was contagious. Resistance became impossible, not because men lacked courage, but because courage itself had been redefined. To protect one's family was no longer an option. To resist meant not death alone, but a legacy of mutilated children, destroyed wives, erased lineages. And so fathers chose survival, though survival came at the cost of their souls. The Senate, once the guardian of Roman dignity, became the instrument of its destruction. They passed decrees legitimizing bastards born of the emperor's assaults. They voted honors for women who served in the imperial cult. They praised Caligula's rituals as divine. Each law passed was a nail in the coffin of Roman honor, hammered in by the very men sworn to defend it. In this way, Caligula's tyranny was different from all that had come before. Other rulers used fear to control bodies. Caligula used shame to destroy souls. He did not merely demand obedience. He demanded participation, and once participation was given, once shame was accepted, there was no return. The Rome of 40 was not a Rome of fathers and mothers. It was not a Rome of sons and daughters. It was a Rome where families had been hollowed out, where bonds had been shattered, where pietas, the virtue that once defined the city, was mocked, twisted, annihilated. What marched through the streets in those days was not a proud nobility, but a procession of shells, men and women stripped of dignity, carrying silence heavier than chains. Rome's greatness had always rested on the strength of its households. Caligula had found a way to dismantle them one by one, turning love itself into an instrument of power. By the year 40, the palace was no longer enough. The corridors of the Palatine had absorbed the screams of Rome's nobility. The chambers had witnessed degradations catalogued with bureaucratic precision, but Caligula wanted more. Humiliation confined to marble walls was too small for a man who believed himself divine. He wanted Rome itself to become his stage. He wanted the empire to see its own soul dismantled in public view, so he invented the lunar ceremonies. On nights of the full moon, the private amphitheater of the imperial gardens was transformed into a sanctuary of depravity. Senators in their formal togas were required to attend, seated in the stone tiers like spectators at a play, but they were not watching gladiators, nor actors, nor musicians. They were watching their wives. The emperor's scepter, adorned with golden phalluses, became both prop and weapon. With it, he directed the scenes like a master of ceremonies. He paired noblewomen with gladiators chosen for brute strength, with Nubian slaves imported for contrast, with animals trained for grotesque displays. The women had no choice. The men had no voice. They sat in silence, their faces masks of composure, while their households were dismantled before their eyes. The scribes were always present. Styluses scratched against wax as if recording a festival. Names, acts, durations, outcomes, all logged with the same precision as a census. These were not entertainments. They were archives of shame, permanent records of complicity. Each senator who sat in silence was bound forever by the knowledge that his wife's degradation had been witnessed, recorded, and preserved. The ceremonies became more elaborate with time. Sometimes contests were staged. Which wife could endure the longest? Which gladiator could impregnate the most? Numbers were shouted aloud like bids at an auction, 10, 20, 30, until the arena itself became a grotesque parody of commerce. Rome had once auctioned slaves in its markets. Now its nobility was sold in the emperor's amphitheater, and yet the city adapted. Merchants outside the palace sold perfumes and oils advertised to cover the scent of shame. Physicians made fortunes repairing torn bodies, stitching wounds that would never heal inside. Poets reimagined the ceremonies as myth, casting noble women as goddesses ravished by divine power, as if humiliation could be disguised as legend. The economy of Rome bent itself around the emperor's spectacle, feeding on the misery it produced. The priests played their part. In temples across the city, forced unions were blessed as sacred. Caligula's body, by decree of the Senate, had become divine. To resist was not merely disobedience, it was sacrilege. The lines between religion, politics, and depravity blurred until they were indistinguishable. What had once been obscene became official ritual. The people, too, bore witness. Rumors spread, whispered in markets, murmured in forums. Everyone knew. Everyone participated, if only through silence. Some profited. Some looked away. Some tried to rationalize, claiming the emperor was imitating Jupiter himself. That myth had become flesh. But no one could claim ignorance. The city itself had become complicit. The amphitheater ceremonies reached their climax in contests Caligula called fertility games. Wives of senators were pitted against gladiators in competitions of endurance, their bodies treated as battlegrounds for numbers shouted by scribes. Victories were measured not in honor, not in glory, but in pregnancies forced and confirmed. The audience of senators sat motionless, their silence the loudest sound in the arena. Caligula thrived in these moments. He was not merely a ruler, but a playwright, director, and critic of Rome's humiliation. He strutted through the arena with his scepter, issuing commands, mocking husbands, laughing at their composure. His joy was not in pleasure, but in domination. In the knowledge that the nobility was now a gallery of broken men watching their own legacies collapse. For the emperor, these spectacles were philosophy as much as entertainment. By desecrating the most sacred bonds, marriage, fatherhood, motherhood, honor, he was declaring himself divine. The gods of myth had done no less. Zeus had taken women by force. Mars had abandoned honor for desire. Why should he, Caligula, not reenact these tales in flesh and blood? In his mind, he was not desecrating tradition, but fulfilling it. But to the men of Rome, the ceremonies were more than philosophy. They were shackles. Each torch held, each contract signed, each silence endured, tied them tighter to the emperor. To resist was to invite not only personal destruction, but the annihilation of one's family. To comply was to live in shame. There was no path left untarnished. The system extended beyond the palace and the amphitheater. A shadow economy grew in the city's alleys and markets. Apothecaries sold abortifacients brewed from herbs dangerous enough to kill. Cunning women offered lessons to daughters of the nobility, not in seduction, but in survival. Black market physicians charged fortunes to restore bodies damaged by ritual service, offering the illusion that something could be repaired. Rome itself was feeding on the wounds of its elite. Every corner of society bent to the emperor's will. Merchants, priests, physicians, poets, senators, all participated. Some openly, some silently, but all were bound. Rome, the heart of the civilized world, had become a city of accomplices. In the amphitheater, the message was unavoidable. Fathers sat as their sons were mocked in painted faces, as their daughters were paraded in silks, as their wives were paired with slaves. And Caligula, from the center of the arena, declared himself master not only of Rome's laws, not only of Rome's armies, but of Rome's very families. The spectacle was total. It was not designed for pleasure. It was designed for power, and it worked. Rome's nobility, once proud defenders of tradition, once guardians of dignity, were reduced to silent actors in the emperor's theater. Their shame was their chain. Their silence was their sentence. In these ceremonies, Caligula reached the height of his tyranny. Not in executions, not in taxation, not in war, but in the public dismantling of Rome's soul, turned into entertainment, archived as bureaucracy, and sanctified as religion. This was not governance. This was theater. This was not cruelty alone. This was philosophy in blood and shame. And Rome watched, and Rome endured, and Rome learned what it meant to live under the spectacle of absolute power. On the night of January 24th in the year 41, Rome's most elaborate theater of humiliation reached its climax. Caligula had staged yet another of his grotesque contests, a fertility competition in which the wives of senators were forced into the arena, pitted against gladiators in a perverse race to conceive. The scribes shouted numbers as if bidding at a slave auction. The crowd of silent senators sat in their marble seats, and the emperor strutted through the arena with his gilded scepter, the master of ceremonies in his theater of shame. But even machines of terror have breaking points. Among the praetorians, men who had been both enforcers and participants in the emperor's system, resentment smoldered. Their complicity had bought them privileges, but it had also earned them humiliation. One of them, Cassius Chaerea, a veteran of the Germanic wars, bore the emperor's mockery more bitterly than most. Caligula derided his high-pitched voice, forced him to speak obscene passwords at the palace gates, humiliated him before his peers. Chaerea had endured, torch in hand like every other soldier. But humiliation, once it curdled into rage, became more dangerous than fear. The next day, as Caligula walked through a subterranean corridor on his way to the theater, Chaerea struck. With him were fellow praetorians, the very men sworn to guard the emperor's life. They cornered him against a cold stone wall and drove their daggers into his flesh, 30 wounds in all. The final blow, struck by Chaerea himself, was delivered to the emperor's groin, a deliberate symbol, ending his reign of sexual tyranny with the mutilation of the body he had exalted as divine. The emperor collapsed in the darkness of the corridor he had once haunted with midnight wanderings. His blood spread across the marble floor, seeping into the very stones that had echoed with the voices of his victims. In the chaos that followed, his wife Caesonia was murdered. His infant daughter Julia Drusilla, barely 2 years old, was seized by a soldier and killed brutally, her head smashed against a wall. The praetorians, in their frenzy, sought to erase every trace of his line, every seed of the dynasty of shame. But erasure was impossible. The Senate, trembling with both fear and relief, declared a damnatio memoriae. Caligula's statues were destroyed, his name chiseled from inscriptions, his coins melted down. Officially, he was erased. Officially, he had never existed. Rome, they declared, would forget. Yet memory is not so easily commanded. The archives beneath the Palatine remained, filled with the records of his system. The pregnancies forced by decree could not be undone. The scars on bodies and the silence in voices like Valeria's could not be erased with a Senate vote. The fathers who had held torches, the mothers who had signed contracts, the sons who had been painted and paraded, these could not forget. Their silence became Rome's shadow. The new emperor, Claudius, a man who had survived Caligula's reign by playing the fool, tried to restore order. He opened the treasury, he rewarded the legions, he reassured the Senate. But the system Caligula had built lingered in memory. Families remembered their complicity. Children born of the selective breeding program grew up inside the palace. Raised in shame, their identities blurred, their lineage polluted by forced conception. Rome moved on, but Rome did not heal. The senators who applauded Claudius carried with them the knowledge that they had once applauded Caligula too. The households rebuilt their facades of dignity, but behind marble walls they knew that their silence had bought survival at the price of honor. And silence, once purchased, rarely finds its voice again. Caligula had not merely ruled Rome. He had written a manual for institutionalized depravity. He had shown how absolute power could dismantle not just laws or armies, but families, bonds, and souls. He had proven that humiliation, when administered systematically, could become a more permanent weapon than fear. And though his statues were toppled, though his name was cursed, the machinery he had built was not destroyed. It lay dormant, waiting for others who would learn the same lesson. That systems of abuse are most effective when they demand complicity, when they make victims into collaborators, when they turn shame into permanence. The victims aged. Some lived to see calmer emperors. Some lived long enough to bury their silence in the earth. Others carried it to their graves. But the stain lingered, not in marble, not in inscriptions, but in memory. The thunder that had rumbled on the night of his ascension, the thunder that had echoed on the night of his death, was not mere weather. It was a warning. For Rome and for every society that follows, the lesson was clear. The greatest dangers are not always the monsters who roar openly, but the systems built quietly, efficiently, bureaucratically. Systems that turn cruelty into paperwork, shame into ritual, violation into policy. Systems that survive their creators, that find ways to be rewritten, that endure like diseases passed from one generation to the next. And so, when Marcus Claudius, the old senator once forced to hold a torch at his own family's destruction, heard the news of Caligula's death, he applauded. He clapped with hands that still remembered the weight of firelight. He clapped for the end of a man, but the silence in his daughter Claudia, recorded in the archives only as number 247, remained. Her silence was the true legacy. Caligula did not invent cruelty. He did not invent lust. He did not invent tyranny. But he perfected something new. He institutionalized humiliation. He built the blueprint for systems that outlive their architects, and if this story unsettles, if it provokes a turning away, then it must be remembered. Because forgetting how systems of abuse are built is the surest way of permitting them to be built again.